Hi, everybody. Today we are going to start our study of genetics, the science of heredity, and this is chapter 3 in your book. Your teacher will tell you on what page you should be writing these notes down. Here are our goals for chapter 3, section 1, which is entitled, What is Heredity? By the time this section is over, I will be able to describe the results of Mendel's experiments. Notice that Mendel is capitalized. That is a person, and he's a pretty important person in the genetics world. He's considered to be the father of genetics. And our second goal is to describe how alleles affect inheritance. Allele is a new word for all of us, and we're going to find out here what that means. So here's a picture of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was a priest. He lived in a monastery in the 1800s. And a monastery is just a big building that refers to the place where the priests live. And so his job for the monastery, because they were a secluded order of priests, which means they didn't get out much, his job was to grow the monastery's vegetables so they would have something to eat. But he had a real keen interest in science, and so he ended up turning his entire garden into a science laboratory and did lots of experiments on the plants. In particular, he did tons of experiments on pea plants. And yeah, we're talking about peas you might have on your plate, and you might have that for dinner at night. He did lots and lots of experiments with those, and that's the topic of Chapter 3, Section 1. And we're going to find out here just what kind of experiments he did and what he found out from it. So first, we have some vocabulary words. Heredity. You've heard of this before. It's the passing of traits from parents to offspring. Please write that down. It's a vocab word. Notice it's in red. This is controlled by genes. We've talked about genes in class before, too. You have not yet seen the word genes or heredity in any kind of a test, but that is soon going to change with the quiz you take in Chapter 3, Section 1. Mendel didn't know that the passing of traits was controlled by genes, but he concluded, and we're going to find this out at the end, is that there were some kind of genetic factors that were involved. Genes was not part of the science vocabulary in the 1800s. So he called them factors. And here's a heads up. I think it's a true false. I can't remember. But there is a question on your assessment that talks about factors. So make sure that you know that that's what Mendel called them. Genetics, and this is also read, put it in your journal, is the study of heredity. In other words, the study of how traits are inherited. These two words, heredity and genetics, are very closely linked, and you are going to need to know the difference between them, because genetics is the study of this, of how traits are passed on from parents to offspring. And then the other thing I need you to write down is that all physical characteristics or traits, and characteristics and traits are synonyms for each other, they're inherited. And some behavioral traits are inherited. So in other words, all of our physical traits that we have because of the genes we got from our mom and dad. And some of the behaviors that we have are controlled by the genes we got from mom and dad as well. Here's a picture of plants, flowers on a plant. And look at flower A here. It's pointing to two organs called a pistil, which is this part right here. And the stamen are these long yellowish things that look like they represent shooting stars with shooting stars on the end of it. The pistil is the female sex organ that's in the plant, and the male sex organ is the stamen. So these threads here are the male sex organs, and this green thing right here is the female sex organ. Now, in the female sex organ, the plant produces ovules. O-V-U-L-E-S. In the human world, those are called eggs. And the male sex organ, which is the stamen, produce pollen. These shooting stars represent pollen. And I think you've heard of pollen before, especially in conjunction with bees. And in the human world, the equivalent of pollen is sperm. So look at plant B here. In plant B, the stamen have been cut off. In other words, there's no pollen present anymore. So really the only thing left is the pistil, which is the female sex organ. So what's happening here is that you take a plant. This is how pollination occurs. You take a plant that maybe doesn't have the stamen cut from them, no more stamen, and with no more pollen on it. And then you take another plant that still has the pollen on it. That would be the white one here. And the pollen, then, this is the job of the bee, the niche of the bee, is to take the pollen from this white plant and transfer it. And remember, that's the comes from the male sex organ, and this gets transferred to the female sex organ. When that happens, this is called pollination. Write that in your journal. It's when pollen reaches the pistil. Pollen is the male part from the sex organ, and then the pollen gets transferred to the female part of the female sex organ. When those two join, that's called fertilization. This is when the egg and the sperm join together. Okay? All right, that we need to understand for the next slide. Next slide is slide 6. Slide 6 and slide 7 I'm going to refer to a lot. They're pretty important. So at this point, no matter where you're at in your journal, I need you to start whatever you're going to write from slide 6. See, this is slide 6. To put this on a fresh new page, okay, at the very top, because there's a lot of information on slide 6, and we want to devote the entire page of our journal for this. So here's a pea plant, and we're going to call this a purebred smooth pea pod plant. Okay? Notice purebred is in red, and so don't worry yet, but just write this down, what that means. We'll get to that here in a second. What slide 6 is going to do is going to describe Mendel's experiments in what he did with pea pods on the plants. Okay, this represents a smooth pea pod, and as you can see, there are peas inside here, and this is nice and smooth, right? The pod is nice and smooth. So he took a smooth pea pod and crossed it with, put an X down, and crossed them. We're only going to write this once. In the future, we're just going to use the X, and you need to know what that means. He crossed it with a purebred bumpy pea pod plant. And this clip art represents, see how bumpy this is compared to the other one? Okay, so this is a bumpy pea pod, and this is a smooth pea pod. So he crossed them with each other. Okay, so let's get some vocabulary here. Purebred means the organism has only one kind of allele. Ooh, allele. Write that down. It's in red. Write all of this down. We're going to talk about what that means here in just a second. So that means this one is purebred because it only has one kind of allele, and this is purebred because it also has only one kind of allele. Let's use the letters big S and little s to represent two forms of a gene. There we go. There's the definition of an allele. An allele is a form of a gene, and we're going to be talking about the trait texture. So what are the two forms of the trait texture in pea pods? Well, you can either be smooth or bumpy. Okay? Those are the alleles. This one has purebred. This one's purebred. It has smooth alleles. This one is purebred, but it has bumpy alleles. Okay? And this one is going to be big S, big S. So what we just found out, that the letter big S is going to represent the allele for smooth, and this one is little s, because it has the allele little s and an allele little s, but little s stands for bumpy, okay? The reason this one has two alleles is because this plant got its genes, its forms of the gene, from it, that got this one from its mom and this one from its dad. This one got one from its mom, this one got one from its dad. Okay? So when these plants grow up and produce pods, these guys are all going to be smooth. When this one grows up and produces pods, they're going to be bumpy. Okay? Now Mendel crossed them. That means he pollinated them. And we're going to show that here in just a second. So we're going to call, Mendel pretended these were the parents. Let's call this one the dad and call this one the mom. It doesn't really matter, but we'll just do that. Okay, so this is the parent generation, and this is how we write it. And this is how you're going to see it, so you need to know what that means. So when pollination occurs, we just found out on the other slide what happens. So the pollen from this dad plant, this male plant, was taken to the pistil of this female plant. Okay? And when that happened, pollination occurred, and when the sperm reached the egg, we got fertilization. And at that point, this plant here could produce seeds inside the pods that would grow from the fertilization of these two plants, of the male part and the female part. So Mendel got pods that had seeds inside, okay, which came from the fertilization of this daddy plant and this mama plant. Then what he got when this one produced seeds, and he took the seeds from this plant, put them in the ground and let them grow up. When that one grew up and produced its own quote-unquote babies, its own seeds, they were all smooth. Every single fruit, every single pod that this plant that came from the union of this mommy and daddy, put in the ground, let them grow, ended up being smooth. Every single one. These are called the F1 generation. You can think of it as the first generation. And these aren't purebreds anymore. These are hybrids. Why do you suppose they're hybrids? Because look where they got their genes from. They got a gene from daddy, who only has big S's for texture, which means smooth, and mommy, who only has little S's for texture, which means bumpy. So these guys here that came as a result of the union of these two, we know that they have a big S allele in them and a little S allele in them, but yet they look all smooth. Okay? But because they've got a big S in them and a little S in them, they're called hybrids. There we go. There's the big S that it got from daddy. Here's the little s that it got from mommy when Mendel pollinated them together. 100% of every seed that he planted from the union of these two, when he put them in the ground, let the plants grow up and produce their own pods, 100% were smooth, even though they had a bumpy allele in them. Where did they get the bumpy allele? From mama over here. All right. So Mendel said that smooth had to be dominant over bumpy. Write it down. It's in red. It's a vocabulary word. So you should be kind of figuring out what dominant means. Dominant means that if you've got two different alleles, one of them is going to be dominant over the other. And in this case, smooth is dominant over bumpy. Why? Because when he planted the seeds that were produced by the union of these two, and he let them grow up, the plants grow up and produce their own seeds, all of them looked smooth. So smooth had to be dominant over bumpy, but all of them have a bumpy allele in them. All right, slide 7. So draw a line after everything that you just wrote so that you know where slide 7 starts in your journal, or use a brand new fresh page. So here's the F1 seeds, okay? So he took the seed, put it in the ground, planted it, and let the plant grow up. And that's what we just discussed, the F1 seeds. These are the first generation seeds. So this is the first generation seed grown up as a plant. And this gets crossed with another one. So remember, Mendel's got thousands of these F1 seeds that came from, the parent generations that were crossed together. And so he's just taking a bunch of seeds, crossing them with each other. And remember, they're hybrids. They've got a bumpy and a smooth allele in them. So both of them are crossed with each other. So this is the F1 generation, the first generation, and they're hybrids. And you know the routine. Mendel pollinated them. That means he took the pollen from this plant and he took it over to the pistil, which is the female organ on this plant, and made pollination happen. And then fertilization occurred when the sperm and the egg from the two plants here got together. And when this one then started producing pods that had seeds in them, and he took those seeds then and put those into the ground and let them grow up. This would be the second generation now, and that's called F2 generation. And you need to write it just like you're seeing it on page 6 and 7 here of the PowerPoint. And what he got was, for every 4 plants that grew up, 3 of them produced pods that were smooth, and 1 produced pods that were bumpy. This is kind of the saying that you and I have all heard of, well, it skips a generation. Yeah, it skipped. Generation 1 never had a plant that produced a pod that was bumpy. It skipped the F1 generation. But now the bumpies are back in a ratio of 3-to-1. Oh, and so Mendel said, traits are not a blend. He had predicted that when you cross a hybrid with the hybrid, that some of them were going to be medium, semi-smooth, semi-bumpy. Because after all, if you put a smooth with a bumpy, it makes sense that you would get an average. But that was not the case. This is not an average. It was smooth, 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 and bumpy. No averages did Mendel discover. And so here's some ways that we could show this. We could call it 25% smooth, 25% smooth, 25% smooth, 25% bumpy, for a total of 75% smooth, right, when you add them together. Or you could do it as a fraction, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4 smooth, for a total of 3/4 smooth and 1/4 bumpy. So these are all the traits. Oh, Mendel said then that bumpy was recessive to smooth. Recessive is the opposite of dominance. Remember, you just wrote down that smooth was dominant to bumpy, over bumpy. Well, that means bumpy's recessive. So Mendel studied 7 different traits. They were seed shape, seed color, flower position, pod color, pod shape, and pod height. And for each of these traits, there were 2 alleles, 2 forms of the genes. For seed shape, he found that the plants could either be round or wrinkled. For seed color, they could either be yellow or green. For flower color, the flowers that are produced by the plants are either purple or white. The position where the flower grows was either on the side or the tips. That's called axial or terminal. The pod color could either be green or yellow. The pod shape could either, this is the one that we just talked about. This was the example we just used. This chart calls it inflated and constricted. We called it smooth and bumpy. And the plant height was either tall or short. Okay? Those are the 2 alleles, the 2 forms of the alleles for each one of the traits. And keep in mind, because you're about to do an activity, that everything that you did on page 6 and 7 is exactly the same for each one of these traits. Me and you wrote in smooth and bumpy for seed shape. We could easily go back and do slide 6 and 7 all over again and instead write in round and wrinkled, purple and white, axial, terminal. You get the idea, tall and short. Everything was always the same. These were all dominant, the ones on top. In the F2 generation, Mendel found 3 rounds for every 1 wrinkled, 3 yellows for every 1 green, 3/4 purple for every 1/4 white, 25% yellow for every 75% green, 75% tall for 25%, every 25% short in the F2 generation. Okay? Here were Mendel's conclusions. Write these down, please. Number 1, individual factors. Remember, he didn't call them genes. He said these were pieces of genetic information. That's what controls the inheritance of the traits. The factors, genes, that you and I call them, exist in pairs. Why are they in pairs? Because we always get one trait, one form of the trait of the gene from mom, and we get one form from dad. So one allele comes from mom, one allele comes from dad. And then one of the factors can mask or hide the other. And a word for mask is dominant. So we just found that out. Smooth is dominant over bumpy. And he also found out that tall is dominant over short. So when it masks it or hides the other one, then it's called dominant. The one that gets hidden is called recessive. There you go. That's the end of chapter 3, section 1. Now we're going to do a pretty cool activity.